I'm going to go through a particular video. This was put out by a YouTuber, No Nonsense Spirituality. And the title of this particular video is How Theology School Turned Me into an Atheist. Now, she has a lot of views on her channel that I don't agree with. I'm going to leave a link, however, to this video in the description. I think she makes some very, very good arguments, or she makes some very, very good points. It's just she lays out a particular case. And this is something that in the history of doing interfaith dialogue and work with religious leaders, I have heard this from the Christian side. I think it's very good to just take it or hear it out of the horse's mouth, so to speak. And this is very necessary for Muslims to know in terms of the addressing the issue. Like, how do, like, oftentimes in Islam we will say things like, or Muslims will say things like, the Islamic position is that the biblical texts have their challenges, and they're not completely reliable in the same manner as the Quranic text is. And oftentimes that, even when we hear different apologists, we hear different arguments being put against the Quran, they totally ignore this particular part. But there is a phenomenon that really occurs within the academic setting, amongst the theologians and leaders and scholars themselves. Like this particular woman says how she went to theology school and she became an atheist. This is a very common phenomenon, and she's going to address it from the perspective of someone who was a part of the Christian tradition. She has a few curse words and things like that, but I think this is very, very important to take note of, and then we'll have some comments.
And so if you accept that this is the way that God spoke to us, and God knew that certain verses would cause unbelievable suffering, then God either wasn't powerful enough to influence the text, or not good, or doesn't care, or doesn't give a shit, right? And then there's also the peer deconstructions, finding out that even professors that you thought were like, hey, he's smart, he must know something that I don't. This was part of it for me, because when I was younger, I really believed that these adults are smarter than me, so they see something then that I don't. And then when you get behind closed doors, you realize all your professors are deconstructing their faith and doing mental gymnastics, and they struggle with some aspects of faith. And when you learn that the people you thought who were smarter than you, who maybe had reasons for their faith that you didn't see yet, when you realize that they're quietly doubting too, it can also blow up your own faith. And the big
So she's been talking about in this video just her process as a student of theology. She was a Christian woman wanting to know more about her religion. And this particular part that she's pointing out now is that, of course, as a young student, coming upon these problems, learning of these problems as they exist in, textual criticism, the veracity of this or that claim, the presence of mythological belief in concepts, and the consistency with a lot of the mythologies of the ancient world in the Bible. You would think, or as a young student, you would think that, oh, the professors can explain this and help me be strong and firm in my faith. But these actual fields of study and branches of knowledge in the final analysis also have served to weaken the faith of those professors and teachers and scholars within the very tradition itself. And this is something that is known in the field.
big secret, this TikTok thing went viral, which is, what is the common knowledge in your field that general people don't know? And for sure, the thing we all know in theology school is that the Bible is complicated, that things are allegorical at best, because literal interpretations can't be true, and the Bible itself cannot all be true.
Now, mind you, she's saying this as a student of theology. So I don't know the TikTok trend, but it's like, what do you all know as a part of that tradition that the common people don't know? And behind closed doors, the students of theology, the professors or whatever, the people who go into that field of study, they know that it's allegorical at best. I actually was at George Washington University about a year ago, having a meeting with one of, I don't want to name who the person is so as to get them in trouble, but she shared with us. She said her first semester, this was a religious woman, she's over some department. She said her first semester in a religious school, she said, I came home and told my grandma, don't you know all of these stories are myths? And she said that her grandma told her in response, she said, you better watch it, because preachers, pastors come and go, but the congregation remains. And she was sharing with us that she was learning in her class that what they were reading about the creation of Adam and Eve and the serpent and eating from an apple, these were borrowed from ancient mythologies. And she was learning this in theology school, Lutheran school in particular, I believe it was. And she was sharing this with her grandmother as a young college student. Her mind is being blown away. And her grandmother is warning her, if you bring that to the congregation, they will replace you. So you better keep that to yourself. I shared, as a matter of fact, I don't have the book with me. We wrote a book on prophets and prophetic types. I was in another dialogue with a preacher. This was in Atlanta. I just referenced George Washington. That's in D.C. And this particular pastor, he told us, we were in dialogue. He kind of blew away his colleagues, or they were kind of shocked that he said it. But he told us that the other leaders of the church in the city of Atlanta, they meet like monthly. He gave some other details. He said, but they discuss whether or not the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ really is representative of the death and resurrection of Christ consciousness in the people. He's telling me and my father-in-law this like in our face. So this is something that is well known behind closed doors. But he said right after that, he leaned forward and he said, but I'm not supposed to teach the common people that, to my face. I'll never forget it. So this is what she's saying right here. The Bible is complicated, and it's complicated for a multitude of reasons. And she says it is allegorical at best. It's not literal. So this is something that we access or we find out once we engage in deeper level, scholarly level, academic level of study of the text, as opposed to what we get in the church on the Sunday, or we hear in Bible study, or let alone what we get on online apologetics.
And that everyone has doubts and non-literal beliefs. And then they're expected as pastors to give the congregation the certainty that the congregation wants, even though they know that it's more complicated than that. And so in seminaries behind closed doors, it's totally normal to go to school and for your teacher to say things like Genesis is clearly, a mythical origin story. And it's borrowing these Babylonian sources, or Isaiah is written by at least 3 different authors, or look at how these nativity accounts contradict each other. These are not just fringe claims. This is consensus among biblical scholars, even those who are believers, right?
So the standard consensus is that books such as, let alone, we know this about Genesis, that's common knowledge. We know this about the Gospels. But she's saying, even like the book of Isaiah, there are a multitude of authors. These myths are borrowed from the ancient Near Eastern traditions, so on and so forth. This is the standard understanding amongst the scholars in the field. This is something that we will never hear brought out from those who defend on the Christian side. Now, let's make a very clear point. What's interesting about all of this so-called new research about the various Qur'an and the various renditions of the different scripts, all of these things are documented in Islamic history. Like the different writings that are found, like the different scripts, like differences in words in the ayahs, etc. What's the Abdullah ibn Mas'ud copy of the Quran, or his mushaf, the Ibn Abbas. The scholars, these are not persons who are engaging this and are discovering this for the first time. On the contrary, they are actually going into the texts that were already written, compiled, verified by Muslim scholars about these differences. These issues have been settled in a lot of ways. There are some areas that require further research, but the point that I'm making at the moment is that these issues are not consistent in the Muslim tradition. Even the issue about the mythological character and nature of these stories is found in the scripture, and we'll talk about that later on, inshallah.
And so in seminary, you're trained to hold complexity. You're trained to read ancient languages. You're trained to understand historical context and literary form. You learn that sacred texts weren't written in a vacuum and weren't dropped from the sky. They're shaped by politics and power and oral tradition and the anxieties of an ancient people who don't even know what germs are, trying to make sense of the world. And that honesty never makes it to the pulpit, because the modern church isn't built to hold that kind of uncertainty. Most congregants, most religious people don't come to church for nuance. They come for clarity and comfort and a sense of meaning, and they want answers and they want confidence. They want their pastor to say, here's what God wants you to do, not, well, ancient scribes disagreed about this, and this Hebrew word here is ambiguous, and the archaeology complicates things further. Like, pastors know this. They've been trained to hold multiple interpretations, while at the same time training to dumb things down to protect the faith of their flock.
So basically, they eat the meat and they feed the people milk. They eat the meat and feed the people milk. So the congregants are babies, and the leaders of the congregation are grown men and women. And this is the problem. This is the challenge with faith today.
And that often means withholding the very tools that seminary gave them. And so the great secret in my field is that pastors, all pastors, talk to each other behind closed doors or in academic settings, or to each other differently than how they talk to their congregation.
Mm,
And they learn how to do this. Like, it's a concept called don't scare the sheep, or sometimes it's called milk before meat,
I
meaning
just
you
said
have
that.
to soften the complexity to give people what they're wanting out of church and what they're paying you for. And so, because that's how you're getting paid, you're not really incentivized to rock that boat too much. And so, what happens is it creates this two-tier system of theological discourse. In the seminary classroom, complexity is expected. Behind the scenes, even conservative pastors will admit that they wrestle with doubt, that they don't take every verse literally, that they reinterpret difficult passages to preserve some kind of morality.
Mm.
But on Sunday morning, they simplify, they sanitize, they omit, they become translators. And not necessarily because they're lying or being deceptive. Like, for example, like a kindergarten teacher who's teaching science is going to like meet the children where they are, even though they know that whatever thing that they're saying, like birds fly or whatever, they know that it's more complex than that. But they know that the academic, historical, literary, psychological truth would destabilize where people are in their faith when they're coming to church. And then those people would.
Now, to be clear, that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. Like when you go to school to learn your ABCs, no one is going to give you Shakespeare in kindergarten. That's fair. They have to build you up. I think the bigger argument here is that even the church structure, the structure of the house of worship is not designed to build the people up. So there's, as she mentioned, there's a two-tiered system in place. Whereas the scholars and the academics, they're in one realm or they're in one world dealing with one set of issues, and the congregation is in another world dealing with its own issues. Uh, but it should be the case, and this is my view. First of all, you have to trust people. Cast your bread upon the water. You have to trust that human beings are able. I mean, we live in a time when we can get degrees in medicine and engineering and things like that. We can understand complexity. Um, but the design is really to keep the people in a certain flock type of mold, to keep them as babies. So even in Islamic tradition, there is this idea, and it's true in really all traditions, that you have to build a person up from one level to the next. This really is just respectful of the natural development process of the human being. We go from concrete to abstract. We go from lesser capacity to higher capacity in terms of understanding. But from the Islamic tradition perspective, number one, the masjid has always been a school. At the same time, it is a place where the circles of knowledge are established. And then at the same time, for someone who wants to progress in their knowledge, the door is not to be closed to them.
Never make it to the more complex versions of faith, and then they would lose their job. So in their mind, it helps no one to give people complexity when people are showing up for simplicity. And that's the quiet kind of crisis of modern theology. There's a gap between what the clergy know when you actually study the Bible and what the laity are told. And once you're on the inside and you see, behind the sacred curtain, it's hard to unsee it. So for some, it will give you a crisis of faith that will deepen into something more mature. But eventually, as that comes out in whatever religion you're in, you'll often get excommunicated for being heretical in some way. And then for others like me, it marks the beginning of the end. And so we have another study. It's Nancy Ammerman's ethnographic research on pastors, which was in 1997. And it was in-depth interviews with pastors. And it found that most clergy kind of manage this kind of dual consciousness where they're privately aware of complex academic theology theology, but they're publicly focused on tradition and clarity and cohesion and being helpful for people and what people essentially want from church. A quote from one pastor in that study was, "We have to interpret things in ways that people can hear. You can't dump the documentary hypothesis on someone in a sermon." And then we have the Barna Group research on pastors and doubt, which was also in 2017. And it said that 26% of pastors said that they frequently struggle with doubt, but they fear losing their role. They're concerned about affecting people's faith and the ethics behind that. And so they just
I have personally met pastors who fit this description. They struggle with it. The evidence, the research, just the nature of their field brings them to doubt. And my personal belief, and this is why we're doing this video, is that if they would accept Islam using their same tools as students, they would see that Islam gives them an answer. As a matter of fact, again, I've quoted this in previous videos, the verses such as those who wrote the book with their own hands, woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say this is from God. Allah even says the narrations in the Qur'an are qasas. Their narration in these narrations are ibarah, are lessons for it's not presented as actual history. And this is something that has been known amongst the exegetes in the Islamic tradition. That's why it's not narrated in the Qur'an in sort of like this linear historical form. It's given as just a narration to communicate lessons. If they would engage the Qur'an, they would find much help for what their own research is really supporting. In other words, the holes and the gaps shouldn't really break their faith. It should really help them on the path to advance, and that advance would lead them to the purity of the Qur'an.
struggle privately behind closed doors. And there's also this belief that doubt is something that needs to be privately processed. Otherwise, you are damaging other people's faith. And then what if you're wrong? And what if God, throws you in hell for that? It's a whole thing. And so across the literature, what we're finding is that clergy and seminary that are trained in critical methods, source criticism, comparative religion, historical theology, it really starts to blow up faith to create a deeper faith, which then you have to struggle with because your congregation's not going to want that, or you're going to lose all your faith altogether. And once you're placed in a church, you're going to feel pressured to simplify and sanitize. And this creates that dual discourse where I will show you videos. You can see them where an academic conference or a theological conference or clergy talking to each other, and they have one language for that, and then they have one language that they use for their congregation. And it's really interesting to kind of watch that double speak. Now, why this is getting to be such a problem in America is that not only does the congregation not want.
So she's going to go further into the political ramifications, so on and so forth. I'm going to end the video here. Again, I'm going to give a link to it in the description, but I think this is a very necessary discussion to have, because if you look at even what we've laid out on the channel thus far, as we've tried to approach it, we're talking about this. This is the Quran study channel, but at the same time, to understand the Quran, we really have to know that it is scripture connecting us to the books that came before. But in order to really appreciate the books that came before, we have to, number one, understand the research, the scholarship that is available about those particular books, according to the testimony of those people who follow those books. And at the same time, sort of running parallel with this, we have to address misconceptions in the public about Islam coming from apologists and persons that claim to represent that tradition. Yet, as we've said before, none of these, like the Islamic dilemma, none of these things are really accepted in academia, because in the academic world, they're dealing with matters such as she laid out. So I'll stop it here. Again, next time we're going to go further into more of these issues. Peace. Assalamu alaikum.